Hey everyone, Nick Diribertis here, teaching you financial modeling. And today we're going to be talking about branching logic with Python conditionals as part of our segment of going beyond an initial Python script, how we're going to learn the Python basics so we can build out complex financial models. So we have talked a little bit about conditionals before in the class, and that was in the context of Excel before. And we talked about the if function in Excel and how that lets us basically check some kind of logical condition and then return one value if that condition is true and return another value if that condition is false. We have the same kind of concept in Python as well, but it's even definitely more flexible in Python, and you can do a lot more with it. But it's the same basic concept. We're going to be checking some kind of logical condition, and then we're going to do one thing if it's true, and we're going to do something else if it's false. So we can see an example here on the slide, and we can see here an if statement. If 5 is equal to 6, then it's going to print not true. Otherwise, else, it's going to print else clause. And it's a little bit covered here in the video, but you can see that it gets else clause here coming up. And that's because this logical condition here, this 5 is equal to 6, that is not true, right? That's false, that 5 is equal to 6. And because it's false, it's not going to go into the if part of the logic. It's instead going to go into the else part of the logic, and that's why we get else clause here. So this is the basic structure. And you'll notice, just like when we did the for loop in Python, that it has the same kind of structure here, that we have the if, and then we have a colon, and then after that colon, we have a level of indentation, and then under that, we have the logic which actually runs under the if part of the statement. And then coming over to the else, it's back over at the original level of indentation. And then we have another colon, and then another level of indentation back to indentation level 1, or the logic that runs under the else clause, the logic which runs if the logical condition evaluates to false. So just like the for, we had for, loop variable in list or whatever, colon, indentation, and then the logic which runs under the for. Same thing here with the if. This is just generally how you have blocks of logic in Python. It's going to be a colon to start that block, and then an indent for all the logic which runs inside of that block. So obviously just comparing 5 to 6 directly is pretty meaningless, right? Like that's always going to evaluate to false. If it's always going to evaluate to false, this code here will never run. It will always just go to the else clause. So we might as well have just not even had the if and just had the else clause, right? Just print else clause. It would have been effectively the same thing. But where it becomes more valuable is when you're actually using variables in these conditions, and those variables could be coming through with different values. So here we can do if this equals that, and that are two different variables that we've defined, and for now we've defined them both to be the same value, but setting it up this way, you could easily define these as other values, and then that would change what the logic is going to do down here. So with here, we have if this equals that, and for now this and that have the same value, and so indeed it's going to run the logic which is under this if, the yes print me. And you'll notice for this one, we don't have any else clause, and that's fine. The else clause is optional in Python. So you can just do an if and then run some code if it's true. And then otherwise, it's just going to go on. It's not, it doesn't have any alternative logic to use. It's just going to continue on with whatever the next code is. And then here we're looking at, if this equals 5, this was defined to woo, so it is not equal to 5, and so it's not going to print this last statement here. It's just going to go on and continue with whatever code we have left in the program. So that's the basic way that you use these conditionals in Python. And of course, most of the time you would probably be doing something more than just printing. You can have as many lines of code as you want under any one of these, as long as they just all keep that level of indentation. So arbitrarily, any kind of code that you want to run under whatever conditions, you can do that using these conditionals. And you may have noticed that here we are using 2 equals, whereas when we had assigned variables, we are using 1 equals. So that's the difference here in Python. A single equals assigns, 2 equals compares. So this is saying is 5 equal to 6, and this is saying this is equal to woo. So subtle difference, but it's just assignment versus comparison. And you want to be careful about that, because if you use the wrong one, you're probably going to get a syntax error, and then you're going to be scratching your head, why is this not working? Single equals to assign, double equals to compare. So then we now have this else condition, which we talked about here. And that we can think of just like in Excel, how, in Excel we had if, logical condition, and then value if true, and then value if false. So the else here is like the value if false in Excel. It's the logic which is going to run if the condition evaluates to false. And unlike Excel, where we're bounded by, you just get one value or you get another value, here it's running any kind of arbitrary logic. So that, can be absolutely anything, and that gives us a lot more flexibility with the way that things are going to work in our models. And then one other way to use these conditionals that we didn't look at here, but we will look at when we go to the example in the Jupyter Notebook, is Elif, which is shorthand for else if. So that's saying, you would put that after an if, then next it would be Elif or else if. And that's just saying, if that first condition was not true, but I'm giving you another condition now, if that one is true, then execute this logic. And we'll make that a lot more concrete here in a moment as we go through the example in the Jupyter Notebook. So that's where we'll jump off to that. We're going to go into the Python basics Jupyter Notebook, which has more drawn out examples on all of this. So moving over to that, and this is broken up into sections matching the sections of the lecture. We're going to use it in all the lectures in this segment. So first here we're talking about conditionals. So for conditionals, this is a little bit of review of what we just looked at. But basically, if whatever condition evaluates to true, then it's going to run the logic which is under the if statement. Again, that indentation is important. If we leave that out, we're going to get an indentation error, expected an indented block. Because we had that colon, we got to have the indent coming after that. And of course, if the condition evaluates to false, then we're not going to get whatever code under here run. And here also show that you can have statements under here, and they'll all execute. You can have as many things as you want going on under here. So what's kind of going on in the background here is it always evaluates that logical condition first and evaluates that into either true or false. So we can actually pull out that condition itself and see what happens when it's evaluated. If we look at cat is comparing that to cat, that evaluates to true. Whereas if we compare it to dog, then that evaluates to false. So these true or false are what we call booleans. That's another data type in Python. And it takes on values of either true or false are the only two possible values for a boolean. And so basically Python evaluates this, and then as it's executing it, it basically substitutes that. And so now we're down to if true, which it will always execute this. It's gonna print got a cat, or in this case it was evaluating cat. Is that equal to dog? That evaluates to false, and so it's not going to print got a cat. And again, as I mentioned before, single equals defines, double equals compares. So here we use the single equals, and that's defining a to be equal to 5, whereas double equals is comparing. This is saying, is a equal to 5? Yes, that is true. Is a equal to 6? No, that's false, because a is equal to 5, which you see here. And if you try to use just a single equals in the condition, then it's going to give you a syntax error. Again, a syntax error just means Python doesn't understand what you're trying to do. You didn't specify things in the correct way for Python to understand it. So because you're saying if a is defined to equal 5, that doesn't make sense. It's expecting to see a logical condition, not an assignment, and so that's why it breaks here if you just use a single equals. As soon as we put that double equals, oh, I have it right here, then it will execute just fine. So that's the basic if. Then we can go to using else as well. The else is going to run if the condition is false. So here I'm defining my variable to be ABC. If it's equal to nope, which it's not, that evaluates to false. Since it's false, it's going to go into the else clause instead of into the if clause. So that's why we get runs if condition is false from the output. And again, pay attention to those levels of indentation. It's, if, colon, indentation, logic that runs under the if, and then back onto the last level of indentation, else, colon, and then up into another level of indentation for the logic which runs as part of the else. If you mess up any of these, say you forgot that else should come back, you're going to again get a syntax error because it does not understand what you're trying to do. Basically, this else is now coming from nowhere. It doesn't understand that it's related to this if. But by having them on the same indentation level, then it is able to understand that this else is attached to this if. And so, here, same thing. Now looking at if it's ABC, which it was, we defined it to be ABC. So that's why we go into the if clause logic now rather than the else clause that we did back here. So then this section here is about elif or else if. And so you don't really ever necessarily need to use elif. It's really just a convenience thing to make yourself not have to write as much logic. And so here's the basic idea of an example where you might want to use elif. And that's, we've got you know, whatever possible prices coming in, we want to basically classify that into, you know, is it cheap? Is it mid-range? Is it expensive? Is it negative such that they're actually paying me rather than me paying them? So that's the idea here. So we run this, price is 100, and we get it's priced into the mid-range. So how do we get there? So it first starts if price is equal to 0. Well, 100 or is less than 0. Price is 100, so that's not less than 0. That's false, and so it's going to go to the next condition. So now we have Elif. So that works kind of like an else, that it builds off of the previous if, but also it checks another condition. So the price was not less than 0, and so we're going to come here, and then we're checking is the price less than 50. So that's basically saying that the price is now greater than 0, greater than or equal to 0, but less than 50. It's in that range of 0 to 50. And if that were true, then it would print it's pretty cheap. But again, 100 is not less than 50. This evaluates to false. And so it's again going to go on to the next statement. Here, you know, else going off of this if, and now it's saying, you know, else basically the price is greater than or equal to 50 because it has failed both of these conditions. Then also if that price is less than 150, then it's going to be priced in the mid-range. So 100 now actually is less than 150, and so that's why we're going to end up in this statement. And then you'll notice that we only get that statement because now this if has evaluated to true, and so the else clause is not going to execute because now we did get a condition that was true, and so it's not going to go into the else. The else is only if the conditions were false. So if we did put the price as 200, then we are going to get up here into the else clause, because here it wasn't less than 0, it wasn't less than 50, it wasn't less than 150. All those evaluated to false, and because they have all evaluated to false, we came into the else clause. Or it could be negative. We end up here because we hit this first if condition. The price is less than 0, so we're here, and then all of these are else based. And so they're not going to run if the prior condition was true. And because the first condition was true, then we don't even evaluate any of these. We just hit here, and then it goes on after this block after that. The else and the elif are only going to execute if the prior condition is false. So the reason that I say that this is really more of a convenience thing to make your code simpler is that you know, this code here does the exact same thing. We can see 100 gets into the mid-range. We can see that 200 gets too expensive. We can see that -10 gets us to you're going to pay me, etc. But we can see that the code is a little bit longer here. So here we didn't use any else, any elif. We just did it all with plain if conditions. But what we had to do here was here we could just, you know, knowing that it was already not less than 0, we could just check if it's less than 50. But here, each if is totally separate. It knows nothing about any of the prior ifs, and so we need to check all the conditions in each one. So here, now this has to be if the price is greater than 0 and is less than 50. In other words, it's in this 0 to 50 range, then we're going to print that. So you need to put both sides of this condition, because we can't count on it's only going to get here if the prior condition failed, because it's going to actually execute all of these conditions and potentially all of the statements if those evaluate to true. So that's, you know, kind of the basics on conditionals in Python. And then looking at the lab exercises, so you're going to be using this same Jupyter notebook for all the lab exercises in this segment. And so here we have 3 exercises on the conditionals, and these exercises You'll notice also build off of some of the material that we've already learned. You're going to have to use a for loop for some of these exercises. So everything in the course kind of builds on each other till ultimately we can build complex financial models. So that concludes the material on conditionals. And we're going to come back next time to talk about grouping objects together using lists. So thank you for listening, and see you next time.